Another white elephant.
Congratulations. Wonderful.
I think we can begin, Michael, and
Absolutely.
drive up.
Great. Let us go ahead and get started.
I'm
So
going to call
let me
it
begin by saying about where we're going in these last weeks. So as you've seen from the syllabus, we of course did not ask you to do any readings for today, and that will be equally true for next week, our final session. The goal of this is twofold. Number one, we want to give you time to work on your final projects and give you the time to think big in these final projects. As we have said, we have no template for what we're looking for. We want you to work through these unanswerable questions, the questions that must be answered even if they're unanswerable, and we want you to work with them at the most exciting level you can, and we look forward to being surprised, and accordingly we want to give you the time to focus on those. And the second reason is, and directly related, we want to increasingly give you all a chance to speak. So thus far, we've been doing, the two of us, a lot of the talking, and then often doing question answer afterwards. And beginning today, we'll be saying a little bit less to give you more of a chance to talk. You're, of course, more than welcome to ask questions, but you can begin the process of making arguments as well if you would like to. And next week, we actually intend to say literally nothing at the beginning, and we will run that final session as an open session amongst all of us. You, again, are more than welcome to ask us questions, but you're also more than welcome to make statements, and feel free if you would like to, no requirement, but if you would like to present ideas from your final projects to the full group, you are more than welcome to do so. So, with that as our hopes for these next 2 weeks, let us launch into what will be a somewhat foreshortened opening discussion to give you time, and again next week to give you full time. So today, in our foreshortened discussion, or it's not for the class, we will be saying a bit more about the implications of these two dominant forms of ethics that we are closing our course with, not to imply again that these are the only ones that hold eternal relevance, as we mentioned last week. Quite the contrary, we are simply arguing we think these are two highly significant ones today. And we have at least argued that an attempt to do any kind of easy synthesis between them at some level is going to betray one or the other, and very plausibly both. So I would like to begin today by saying a few more words about that in terms of the implications of these ideas, what it would mean to work across them in tension without a synthesis, and talking about the larger implications of what that might mean.
And Michael,
So,
just to add a footnote to that, and the intention is to discuss today more generally the problem that we label the cognitive gap. That is, the extent to which any of these orientations to existence, including the ones that we discussed earlier in the course,
yes,
can or cannot be justified.
Yes, indeed. So, let us, as always, you will not be surprised to hear at this point, jump back 3,000 years, again, rejecting our modernity paradigm and rejecting that the only ideas that can be taken seriously arose in Europe and Asia in the past 2 centuries, and looking back at this period 3,000 years ago, when you get this, as we have argued, revolution in attempts to deal with these issues, all of them see a radical problem in the world at every level. A radical problem in how humans are living their lives, how societies are accordingly organized, and larger visions of the divine as well. All of them are trying to radically revise them. However, and the however here can be a negative or positive, and is probably some combination of both, the ways they see the problem also will foretell the kinds of answers they will devote themselves to trying to answer, and in the rereadings and rereadings of the subsequent 3 millennia, will continue to dominate the terms of the discussion. in both powerful ways and, as we've seen repeatedly, in dangerously restricting ways. This is also why, in our current attempts to rethink them yet again and reread them yet again, we will be constantly confronting that gap between them and the cognitive gap of their perceived problems, their perceived solutions, and the problems they are accordingly hoping to solve, because they are making assumptions that they will try to question, and yet by definition it will pre-give the kinds of problems that they see need to be solved. So that's a very abstract way of putting it. Let me immediately jump to the concrete. If we are looking at the ethic of self-fashioning, the opening move, as we have seen repeatedly, is you are, in its more recent version, and then I'll get back to 3,000 years ago, you are seeing the problem as one of the ego entrapped in a body and entrapped in a structure that limits it. And once that is seen as the problem, needless to say, your goal is to try to give increasing levels of agency to that ego so it will not be held too much down by the structures that otherwise imprison it. As we have seen, the main model for doing that, model being perhaps too weak a word, the main images, terminology, and visions for agency come out of the vision of a transcendent creator deity who created this world, and we, if we can increase our agency, become more like that creator deity, such that we can live more fully and not be controlled by structures that otherwise imprison us. It is therefore a vision of divinization based upon a transcendent creator deity. We become more human by becoming more divine, and more divine by becoming more creative, more transcendent in the sense of breaking from structures. And then, as we've argued repeatedly, in the rereading of this tradition now, we need to rethink this entire understanding of structure so that it does not simply become the kind of endless revolt of the transcendent subject against everything else, which is always going to be perceived as the structure. And that then becomes the key question in terms of the implications of how do you do it, a topic that we have devoted several weeks to thinking about and will undoubtedly continue to think about for the rest of our lives. If, on the contrary, you turn to the ethics of connection, at some deep level, we could say it's a comparable concern, but perhaps deep isn't the word here. It's kind of the opposite. The similarity is a perception that something is horribly wrong, but actually the way the problem is understood is quite different. And the build up around the notions of the religious background that they're working from will accordingly take them in a radically different direction. So we have in this class focused in particular on the early Chinese tradition, the emergence of Confucianism, and here, if the opening problem is seen to be a world in which if everything is sets of relationships, the danger is when those relationships harden to the point where there's not full interaction. Now, even if there's full interaction, that can go in all sorts of different ways because there is no transcendent creator deity guiding it. There is no pre-given structure in the world, and more importantly, there's not even an enduring structure in the world. Any structure that exists is either a momentary sets of patterns of interaction, or at worst, a hardened set of patterns that become relatively unchanging for a while, but that's what you're trying to always push against. So your problem isn't revolting against a structure, or I guess you could say in kind of way it is, but you have to shift the way we're conceptualizing structure. A structure is not a part of the world. There is no inherent structure. It is simply a hardening of relationships. This is true at every level. I began before discussing the cosmological level. Here, let me just say, going the exact opposite direction, the medical level. So one of the constant concerns in medicine is you're aiming at constant movement. So if I have pains here, it means there's a blockage of the movements of the energies, the qi. And the goal is to open up that blockage. If I am becoming overly angry, It means I've become overly dominated by my chi, my hot yang chi. And then it's a question of working out of the yang chi, so I'm no longer responding to the world in this one mode, but becoming, again, more interactive. It is always about breaking down locked forms of patterns or breaking things that prevent a flow of energies. This, again, is true of the cosmos in general. We are constantly being asked to rethink the world, contrary to the way we usually perceive it, as being constant shifts and forms of interaction. So what we perceive to be a structured world of distinct egos, distinct people in a structured environment, is in fact patterns of interaction that if they have become so hardened to be as I just described it, that's a problem. And you are constantly trying to break down those patterned forms of interaction that cease to allow anything of real interaction going on. Accordingly, the notion of divinization, as we've discussed, goes in a completely different way. Increasing agency, if we're going to stick with that word as a comparative category, does not mean you become more like a transcendent creator deity. You do, and this is taken very literally, you do become more divine and more spiritual, but as we noted, the notion here of the spirit is, think of the spirits, this is plural, above as being flawlessly resonant forms of energy. So as we mentioned, the common distinction is made between mud, which we can move, but is not resonant and responsive and able to work with the world, versus the spirits above, who are reputedly seen as being stunningly resonant and incredibly able to alter interactions and work with interactions and shift trajectories. And the vision of self-divinization is, if you are doing the cultivation required, you are becoming more divine, but again, it is a radically different vision of divinity. You are not becoming more transcendent. You could, using the term broadly, say you're becoming more creative, but not in the sense of a radical creator deity, as the forms of divinization coming out of Christianity. You're becoming more divine in the sense of connection. Connection and ability to resonate and alter the world and work with the world. Now, I've begun with this statement to then ask what it would mean if we were to not try to bring these together, but to work with the tensions between them. As we discussed last week, the danger of an easy synthesis of these two is that at best you're going to end up doing dramatic harm to one of the two. Best case scenario, you're probably going to end up doing dramatic harm to both, because at some level, if you focus on the ego, you are breaking from a vision of connection, which by definition would say a hardened ego, well, self-fashioning would not want a hardened ego, but from the point of view of the ethics of connection, any notion of a singular self is potentially dangerous. And going the other way, from the point of view of self-fashioning looking at an ethics of connection, breaking down the self to the extent to which it is being called for in the ethics of connection would, by definition, be a denial of the possibility of the radical self-fashioning in a transcendent creative sense. So at some level, you're going to have to betray one to try to synthesize them. And again, I say best case scenario because more likely in the synthesis, what you're probably going to end up doing is simply taking a radically lesser version of each to try to make them sound very similar, which again, as we've discussed, is certainly doable, but if the goal is to read them in their strongest possible form, then by definition, that is precisely what we would not want to do. So, if there is a cognitive gap between these perceived solutions and between the two solutions given, what in the world do we do? So, let me throw out a possibility, and I will be completely honest in what I'm in how I'm framing this, although that will be obvious in about 2 sentences anyway. I am reading this from largely the ethics of connection point of view. So, so even though I'm going to be arguing against a synthesis, please feel free to reject what I'm about to say in many regards, but certainly one of the most obvious would be to say, well, aren't you even perceiving tension from the point of view of an ethics of connection. And I think that is a very valid criticism. With that being said, I will jump in nonetheless. So, using an ethics of connection way of thinking about this, having conflicting perspectives, radically conflicting perspectives, radically opposing, and indeed, perspectives might be too weak a word, radically different understandings such that they wouldn't even necessarily both see the other as a different perspective, that in itself is not seen as a problem if, for example, you're looking at the traditions that we've been talking about coming out of China. On the contrary, that is seen to be a fact of the world. That is a fact of the world. To give you an example, I mentioned briefly before, his name is Zhuangzi. If you want to look him up, it's Z-H-U-A-N-G-Z-I. Zhuangzi is a figure coming after Confucius. This is the figure, to quickly remind you, is the one who will make the argument that Confucius is right, but too limited, too focused on the human, too focused on these role reversals of people in your immediate life, and he's trying to radically expand it by trying to literally have us take the perspective as we work through the text of everything in the cosmos. And again, calling it multi-perspective is too weak a way of putting it. These go beyond even perspectives. His argument is, I want to even break down an anthropocentric way of thinking about the world, the most difficult ones, by definition, for us to break down. He wants to break down our as he would call them, dangerous ways of understanding life and dangerous ways of understanding death, all of which to him are too limited. So, from that point of view, the argument would be any one position that is being taken is by definition dangerous in potential circumstances, which means you are trying to train yourself not to hold on to any single position for any length of time. Now you might say, isn't that a self-defeating argument if you are saying, if not in so many words, at least by implication in the way you're writing the text, that you're trying to give us these different perspectives? It is, which is why another key technique he will constantly use is he will constantly undercut his own text. The point being, take this as a philosophy to follow, and you're already going to fall into the danger I'm talking about. So it's endlessly undercutting itself. Now, could we build a constructive vision out of this? I'm going to say yes. And the constructive vision would be along the following lines. What you are intentionally trying to do is to take every position, we're discussing two, but we've mentioned, albeit briefly, a third being Buddhism, and had we had more weeks, we could have gone beyond even those. And your goal is to try to take each at its most radical form, precisely so that, among other things, it can challenge your most basic assumptions. And the goal, therefore, is not, I suspect, to allow one to win, which would by definition be self-defeating, but your goal is to allow it to challenge your most fundamental assumptions, because that challenge will help in the process of trying to give you the most radical possible reading of the others too. A strong challenge from the most powerful reading we can give of, say, the ethics of connection would be, by definition, a fundamental challenge to the vision of self-fashioning, as would be, needless to say, notions of the no-self coming out of Buddhism, about as radical a challenge as you can imagine. The goal is to do that work, not to therefore be convinced and to reject self-fashioning, but to help you hone its most powerful version and to go the other way. What is lost in an ethics of connection that at least is in danger of pushing in its strongest form the vision of connection to the point where you break down the notion of a stable ego? Is that dangerous? Of course. But what are the dangers? What are the dangers of taking the doctrine of no self to too far of an extreme, which is, of course, a huge topic in Buddhism? You are breaking down the self, but still living in the world and trying to act compassionately in the world. What in the world does that mean? Is that not contradictory? Of course it is contradictory. So the argument would be we should not try to synthesize these, but happily live with the fact, well, I'll take out happily, live with the fact that they are absolutely not going to be synthesizable, and the moment at which we think they are, we're doing something very, very dangerous. And if we can do this, the goal would be to begin to get at one of the projects we've been trying to undertake in this course. Please.
Yes, in the past, you've mentioned that we need to teach subjects in schools from two perspectives in
Yes.
order for students to get comprehensive understanding rather than just one perspective. With what you're saying now, you're saying that there is not the best way to teach this information.
Yeah.
But you also said that it is helpful to teach it in a way that you're taking the most radical perspectives on
Yes.
both ends. Do you see that also being applied, like the most radical perspectives being applied in a classroom,
Yes.
since you can't synthesize it, or what would be your approach to that?
Yeah, great question. And let me answer with a very concrete example of my own education, because I lived through this. So the first side is something that will make perfect sense to all of you. You've all gone through some variation of this, regardless of what discipline you've been studying. In my particular version of it, I was trying to study China in an American university, and the particular form it took was that we were, of course, being trained in theory and looking at, in my case, China, which meant, as I intriguingly didn't even notice at the time, because it was just so natural that, of course, this is what one would do, I was reading entirely Euro-American thinkers from the 19th and 20th centuries exclusively. So I was reading Hegel and Durkheim and Weber, etc., etc., etc. And then we would be, and this was the verb used, asked to apply that to our area of interest, in my case, China. So the implication is theoretical concepts are Euro-American, and non-Euro-American cultures are the objects of your study that you are applying these ideas to. Now, was that at one level productive? Of course, incredibly. In fact, it's not an exaggeration to say basically all scholarship produced in Euro-American universities come from that model, with very few exceptions. And have we learned a lot? Huge. So I emphasize this strongly to say, using ideas from one culture and reading another, I'm not arguing is a bad thing. The moral of this is not only use ideas from one culture to study that culture. On the contrary, I think it can be incredibly productive to take lenses, in this case largely secularized Protestant ways of understanding the world within a modernity framework. It can open up lots of questions when you're looking elsewhere. So there was a productive side to this. There was also, needless to say, a horrifying side to this that was, needless to say, replicating all of the dangerous ethnocentrisms and imperialistic thinking that we've been talking about from the modernity narrative. So getting back to the heart of your question, how do we get around this? Again, I think the solution is not to say, well, sticking with this example, let's use Chinese text to study Chinese ideas. That to me is not the solution. To me, what is a possible solution? Turn it around, role reversal. So take ideas from China, treat them as theory, and reread the so-called modern world, in other words, Euro-Asia, from those theories. Taking political theory from, say, a Xunzi, which, as we mentioned briefly, is all about training yourself to see the worlds as patterns, ignoring the claims that are made about it, but saying, look at how the actual patterns of interaction are playing, what are the trajectories of those patterns, and then concretely, what are the things you can do to alter them? And so when we do that, do I think that opens up new ways of thinking about America? Absolutely. If we can break ourselves from thinking, oh yes, we're a democracy, and say, okay, fine and good, but let us actually see what are the patterns playing out in the ways institutions are set up, the way the market is being defined, the way legal institutions operate, the way we define the self, the way we think about the self, the way we enact the self on a daily basis. And if we are trying to look at a body of theory, in this case sticking with my example, from classical China, to rethink that, do we see it in a completely different way? Yes, absolutely. Now, what would this mean for a classroom? Sort of what we're trying to do here, but I'll stick with my example to play it out. It's not that I want us to not use theories to look at other cultures. I want to expand that dramatically. And in that example, I would have loved if I were a student, if that had been the way we were thinking about theory and culture, which by definition would quickly break down the whole notion of what a theory is and what it means to apply it to theory, because in the latter case, it's no longer an application in any strong sense of the word. And to me, that would be wonderful. And if you could expand that and say, okay, but those are just two arenas, could you bring in more? And I'll use the word in the broadest sense possible, theories and philosophical approaches to rethinking. Bring in Buddhist perspectives, bring in more. Would that be incredibly opening as well? Yes, but then of course, and this last part won't surprise you, but it's perhaps the key of it all, you can't stop at the fun and exciting exercise of doing the role reversals. As we noticed in these role reversals rituals, they work if you take the next step. They work only if you take the next step. It isn't just exciting to be the king if you're a young child. I'm sure it is exciting to be the king if you're a young child, but it only works if you then take it to the next level and then say, how then do we wrestle with the world once we are beginning that work of doing these multi-perspectives, which means, again, the word perspective becomes a little bit too weak. We're not just taking a different perspective on, in this case, America, or a different perspective on China. What we're doing is actually rethinking what it means to live in the world and understand the world and alter the world. And that, to me, should be the goal of education. And I would say this class, obviously it's doing it in a different way, but the goal has been much the same. The goal has been to try to introduce to you, and we know the insanity of our syllabus, but hopefully in a good way, to try to introduce, in this case only 3, but 3 is still a lot in 13 weeks, radically different visions for the conduct of life, and each time, for each of them, asking you to take them as seriously as possible, reading them in as strong a form as possible, learning from the lesser ways they have been read in the traditions, and asking what it would mean to reread them in their strongest terms, and then to do the work of actually, I won't say bring them together, but allow them to work with each other. Not to synthesize them, not to weave them together, but to allow the complex work of challenging and rereading that becomes possible precisely if you take the discipline to really, really read each of these in their strongest possible forms. So thank you, wonderful question. Yes. Please, yes.
I don't know if you wanted to do further introduction.
Oh, and no, we're happy to run this however. So if there are questions now, please jump in.
It's more of a comment, and I don't think it's contrary to anything you just said, but I think another interesting question that I've found myself asking is what is American and what is Chinese now? I mean,
Right.
there's great books. I think Liu Qing, the philosopher, talks about, to the extent that certain ideas about economics or like philosophy have proliferated in China and become part of Chinese thinking. I think in like many respects, these ideas are not just Chinese or just
Yes.
American. And I think it's still useful, exactly like you say, to sort of maybe look at Zhuangzi and apply it, or not apply it, but use it to question certain things going on in America. I think it just seems increasingly difficult if you have a sense of like the degree to which the world has kind of become enmeshed with each other, or like Professor Unger says,
Yes.
the romantic project that speaks to people in China and maybe in sort of like characteristic or like clownish ways. But I think what do you do about just the inseparability of thought in the world today, and do you risk like cementing us versus them versus this is our way of thinking versus another way of thinking when the thought is now available to anyone to the extent that censorship isn't can't like block it for you.
Yes.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, no, beautifully asked question, and I think you've perfectly given the sort of Scylla and Charybdis that we're all facing right now. On the one hand, absolutely, the wonderful potential that should be available to us, even though I think as a world we're failing to live up to it, would be exactly that, to use Roberto's wonderful phrasings, the possibility of throwing off the dust of history and ultimately being able to drop the idea of Chinese from the ethics of connection, or Western from the idea of self-fashioning, and these ideas should be brought to their fullest form, throwing off the cultural ways they have been developed, because by definition, those are always going to be limiting in some ways. It may have been incredibly powerful and inspiring for the opening moves and repeatedly in the rereadings, but at some level will always be limiting. And in the strong form of that, as you said, would be the us-them argument, which would be the nightmare, or probably the most typical one in the world today, which is there are Western values and there are Asian values, and these are two totally different worlds, which means by definition you cannot learn anything from the other. A nightmare scenario. That's the Scylla. The Charybdis is the other one you mentioned, which is, these ideas are beginning to break that down at one level, but sadly that level is the liberal cosmopolitan model, which isn't a real challenge. What it means is the world increasingly accepts the neoliberal model of the individual, and then the individual can sort of pick and choose amongst the versions of the world that they get. But of course, by definition, the versions of these worldviews they get are incredibly, dangerously domesticated versions that by definition don't challenge one in the slightest. And that strikes me as the real danger, where we are getting a liberal cosmopolitan world developing that people will say, oh yes, I read philosophy from here and there, but the versions they're getting are ones that would not challenge their way of life in any manner, shape, or form. It makes one feel like one's cosmopolitan, but we're not really being challenged in any way. And needless to say, and here the Scylla-Charybdis model doesn't quite work, each plays against the other. The more one goes down the liberal cosmopolitan model, the more this other model takes the form of a radical, often right-wing nationalistic movement of our values versus their values, and often the response to that is more of the liberal cosmopolitan model. Both of these are incredibly dangerous, and each plays off of the other. So, getting back to your question, yeah, I don't mean to imply what I'm about to say is going to be easy, but I think the goal is to say, if we are now living in a moment when, yes, we have access to huge numbers of great visions that have arisen in the world, and that's still a tiny fraction, because so many have been lost to history for all sorts of sad reasons, but even the number we have is still extraordinary. And if we can avoid the, this is an American way of thinking, that's a Chinese way of thinking, Western values versus Asian values, that horrible vision. If we can also avoid the liberal cosmopolitanism where everything becomes kind of like everything else, and on the contrary, really try to do what we've been doing a piece of in this class, to try to read each of these philosophical views in their strongest form, which means pulling them out, ripping them out, happily so, of their limited cultural contexts, giving them the strongest readings, and then allowing them to really challenge each other, such that we will take the most powerful vision of one and be suddenly challenged by the other. That, to me, should be the goal of an education. And what would that mean for a life? Well, it should be the goal of a life education. So I don't just mean education in the sense of while we're at a university, although I think it should certainly be part of what we get in this education in the university and pre-university levels. But what would it mean for a life if we took this on as a vision of our education? I have no idea, and I mean that in a wonderful way. I have no idea what sorts of revisionings we could make for ourselves and the world around us were we to do this. But what I would say is, if you look at the moments when any one of these traditions have been read in the most powerful ways, and you look at the lives that have been led and the kinds of political work that have accomplished, that have come from those, it has been extraordinary. And when you look at history, the sad part is it's rare, but when it's occurred, it has been stunning, amazing. And then imagine doing that with something that sadly people in first millennium BCE did not have access to. We can build on several of these. And imagine where that could take us. Or more importantly, again, we can't imagine where it would take us, but that's why it's so exciting. The possibilities could be extraordinary. And that, I think, is what we should be setting out as our goal. Nothing short of that. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, follow up, please, of course, yeah, please.
So I think, yes, I think that's wonderful. I feel like we're just, which is not, like, I think everyone knows this, I feel like we're in a defensive position on the instead of moving forward, it seems like given the alternatives, we're just in a liberal democracies where this some muddled down
Yes,
version of this works
that's right.
sort of the best, and at this point it's so under threat that we're just focusing on maintaining that. And I think what both of you would argue is that in order, that's a doom loop, we need to get beyond it itself. But that seems, it's just like a snake eating its own.
Yeah, no, I think that's exactly right.
So-
Yeah. But I think that is exactly right. I think liberalism or democracy, but sort of the liberal democracy that you see in America and Western Europe has taken a totally defensive position, simply saying let's preserve what little bit of democracy we still have against the emergence of right-wing movements, and it's taking this completely defensive position of like let's keep something. And it's obviously understandable why that would be occurring, and yet exactly as you mentioned, it's incredibly dangerous because in its most defensive, weakest portion, it is obviously going to make the weakest possible argument and the weakest possible call for support. And so I agree completely. And I would also add, I mean, it needs to take responsibility. I mean, that entire vision of liberal democracy being so invested in these modernity paradigms that we have been discussing, it created the complacency that we now know so well. Because once you have this vision that we in Europe and America, beginning in the 19th century, have kind of figured everything out. We kind of know how to work, what the best way for individual happiness is, what the best way to organize a market and a government to allow personal happiness to exist in America. That same is enshrined, of course, in the American Constitution. That's flawless and perfect and should never be rethought. Once you're there and you're committed to the idea that this is a proper modern perspective, unlike everything that has existed before, which means, again, you take out the possibility of learning and being challenged from any other idea. Once you've got that, it by definition builds in an incredible complacency, which means when it starts failing, and of course it's going to fail, every system will be failing constantly, but instead of actually seeing, of course it's failing, and we shouldn't think of it as a system, and we should constantly be rethinking it anew, you say, it's already perfect. And then we should not be surprised that you start getting radical rejections of that order. It's built into that vision that of course you're going to get that. So, getting back to your point, with which I completely agree, yes, I think the first step toward rethinking the world is to break out of that defensive posture and break out of all of the visions of humanity and world history that underlies the complacency of that vision to begin to rethink everything. Yes, please.
Professor, as we've explored different domains of philosophy and we've explored three different very diametrically opposite ideas, I wanted to ask you, because we have been trained in a very Western school of thought, I just want to ask you, because I'm from the Kennedy School, I just want to know when you say that we should be able to hold space for all of these seemingly disparate ideas, to what extent do you think it's okay without it being co-opted within a very Western
Yes.
educational institute, so that we don't see things like yoga being
Yes.
now served as something which is just for exercise and completely divorced from the spirituality of yoga and all of that. So I just wanted to know how much is too much.
Yes. And I think it's a wonderful point, and let me just stick with your example and throw in another one into the mix to underline its significance before I turn to the answer. I think that is exactly what is going on. So, sticking with America as the obvious example, since we're all here at the moment, this is what is going on, and it's directly related to the claim that we're becoming more cosmopolitan too. And the way this operates in practice is, yes, you will do yoga in the morning to feel good, and then go about your workday unchanged. Maybe if you're more complacent because you feel a little bit better, and you can put up with the miserable 9-hour job that awaits you. We mentioned before, this is sadly going on now in corporations that will do Buddhist meditation, which will mean literally like you go out for 10 minutes, or you go into a room for 10 minutes, you meditate for 10 minutes, and then you stop. And the reason I say stop at 10 minutes is if you meditate for any length of time, like you do not come out a happy worker. So you have to stop it in 10 minutes and like, okay, you're calm, you're happy, you'll be a complacent worker, get back to work. And yes, it's not only a dangerous appropriation, it's a dangerous appropriation exactly as you said, precisely to enhance or build in more strongly, if anything, that would be a better way to put it, a complacency about the world we live in. Like, do this, meditate for 10 minutes, do yoga in the morning, and you'll be a more complacent worker for the next 9 hours because you won't be as angry at the miserable work that's being thrown at you. And I agree. This is horrifically dangerous, and it's all the more scary because that's the predominant way that these practices are being brought into America. So, getting back to your question, how do we do the opposite? Again, I don't have easy answers, but the sorts of things we need to do, and again, I'll pick up on your language, which I think captures it, we need to create the spaces where these practices are being brought in with the full implications of what they mean, even when, and I would put it more strongly, precisely because, they will fundamentally break down our assumptions. To stick with the meditation example, I mean, the reason, again, it stops at 10 minutes is like, you do not become a complacent worker if you're a meditator. Meditation, these are incredibly strong techniques that were developed over centuries and centuries, and they work, and they work for the goal. They work to break down your sense of self, break down the world we've constructed around ourselves, break down, to use the Buddhist terminology, the world that where we are Siddhartha in that palace trying to create a world where we're happy, not seeing the suffering we're creating. And you do this, and like, you don't go back to a 9-to-5 job happy and complacent. So we need to do the equivalence of that. And this course, only 13 weeks, but is an attempt to do that, and we need more of it. As I'm sure is painfully obvious, we've got two white guys here talking about these ideas. In future versions of this course, or whatever future courses would be thought that would go in radically new directions, all of that needs to be broken down. We need to create spaces where there are real fundamental challenges to our basic assumptions of the world, our basic modes of being in the world, our basic practices of the world. I absolutely do not want this restricted to the educational world, but that's an obvious place to begin the work because we can at least start trying to do it in specific places, and hopefully it opens up the possibility for it to continue. And again, I don't have an easy answer as to how to do it. This class is one experiment among many of doing it, but I think this is a goal that we should all be devoting ourselves to, and not just, again, in the educational sphere. So thank you. And yes, please.
So I have a conundrum about freedom of speech, because it seems to me that anything you're talking about would require a huge amount of openness and possibility to explore ideas.
Mm-hmm.
And those same, I mean, just to like plant my own flag, I have become very attached to the idea of like open communication and exploration ideas, because like I've been lucky to study in other places where those conditions aren't a reality, and conversations are just shut down in the interest of preserving order. And I think, but that those same conditions also facilitate retrenchment of more whatever counter-revolutionary or counter-reform ideas. So it seems freedom of speech can be the mechanism that we can break free of our egos and become more connected, but also it can entrench our egos. So does the world that both of you are talking about require a sort of fundamental basis that we need to have open communication, and is that complicated by the incredible complexity of technologies and all these things that are like beyond the control of any one individual? Because it seems like you can't compromise on that just in order to do what you want to do, but it's also sort of the double-edged sword.
I agree. I think it is a double-edged sword. As you said, we absolutely need communication and, speaking from the ethics of connection side terminology, the ability to truly connect. But that connection also means fundamentally challenging, and you're absolutely right. The liberal notion of freedom of speech, one of the many dangers it entails is it takes out the challenging side. It works exactly along the lines of, in fact, it's based in the same vision of property rights. It arose at the same time, the same vision. Imagine this domesticated vision of divinization where every individual is a god in that limited sense of having their own property. And freedom of speech is the same way. Oh, I can have my property and you can have your property, and we'll have rules by which the limited ways in which you can get my property, so the government can take a little bit of my property for taxes, but not too much. And so we have there are limited ways that we can take each other's property, but basically the system is set up so that we can basically keep our property with minimum conflict. And freedom of speech ideas arose at the same time, and it's the same vision. So I can speak what I say, and I will tolerate you speaking what you say, but of course it's like property. I can tolerate that because I don't have to really listen to you. Because I already have my ideas, just like I have my property. And so there's an incredible danger where the way it's set up, it creates a world where we don't have to really listen to each other. And that, needless to say, can play, and we can give endless examples of how that plays out in real life, where we're not really challenging our fundamental assumptions. We accept that we're liberal individuals, each with our own ideas, and we will tolerate the ability of someone to say something else. To give an example, one of the leading political theorists right now is a figure called Jürgen Habermas, and Habermas's basic vision is to say he's a straight modernity thinker, and he thinks the key issue for the rise of modernity, which he thinks, surprise, surprise, is exclusively European and American, typical modernity thinking, and he argues the key of it is this, that we are finally moving toward what he will call the ideal speech situation. He doesn't think we're always there, but we're getting closer to it than we have in previous world history. And the key is, in the ideal speech situation, anyone can say anything and we'll learn from each other, which sounds fine when it's put that way. But then, in practice, what it means is exactly what you said. Like, that assumes we are all going to accept that we are liberal individuals, each with our own property, able to talk to the other, and will listen to the other and tolerate what the other says. But anything that undercuts that entire framework would be, by definition, ruled out because it would be undercutting what is seen to be the absolute basis for the possibility of this modern ideal, or the possibility of the modern ideal free speech situation. Now, that is not the same argument that we should get rid of freedom of speech, obviously, but it is to say that we should always, speaking from Chinese political theory in this case, I'd love to drop the Chinese eventually from this, that it would just be known enough that I could say Shunza, that we should look at the patterns that play out when we embark in that, and the degree to which it embeds us in a certain assumption about the self and an assumption about the world that itself should be at least open to questioning.
So then just
Yeah, of course.
I'll
Please, of
talk
course.
to you.
No. Yes.
So wouldn't the strategy, just like interpersonally, be to focus on ethics, not using law to try and control the speech environment? Because it seems
Yes.
like the vision you're talking about is if it's severely challenged, it's also benefited and requires a kind of basis of like basic exploration and communication. Whereas like any kind of like co-opting of law and institutions to control speech would basically put the kibosh on whatever kind of exploratory project. And I think that's the scary thing in modern world today. It's just like in whatever possible directions, the parameters of discourse are threatened, and that could have negative consequences in many different ways. So the focus should be on ethics.
Yes. Well, this is one of the many reasons that Roberto and I have decided to focus this course on ethics. And of course, we began it, of course, with our the first set of readings on ethics as we do not mean it, which do exactly what we were just discussing. Ethical formulations that presume rational, individual, liberal agents in a ground that's unquestionable, deciding how to live properly in ways that won't harm the other's property too much. That's the vision of ethics we're rejecting, and indeed our focus has been to say, if you think of ethics in a strong sense, that to us is one of the, it's certainly not the only, but certainly one of the key ways to really get at these problems. Because if you begin with the ethical, then you can open up all of the issues from our conduct of life, the focus of this course, to the political implications, and all of that comes, as you said, from the ethical rethinking of the world. as opposed, as you said, to immediately beginning with institutional responses, which by definition can often, if you're not really focusing on them, just be replicating our worst patterns and our worst set of assumptions that we're not even often seeing.
So
Yeah, Roberto, please jump in.
implicit in this conversation, and now I think is the time to make it explicit, is our theme of the cognitive gap. That is, the extent to which any of these orientations to existence can be argued,
Yes.
as opposed to just asserted or embraced.
Yes.
And I'd like to say a word about that
Yes.
in relation to our whole program in the course, and not just to the conflict between these two contemporary moral visions that we've been exploring in the recent weeks. So, what are the main kinds of arguments by which we can try to justify one of these orientations to existence? So one of them is that the orientation to existence be compatible with what we independently know to be true about ourselves or about the world. The second is that the orientation to existence resonates with what we have reason to believe are our deepest, most persistent, and most universal longings, right? And a third kind of argument that we can make is the self-fulfilling prophecy that mentioned at the beginning of the course. Each of these orientations to existence is a self-fulfilling prophecy. It says, act as if I were true, and you'll make the world more like what I say it is.
Yes.
And so then we can act out the prophecy, and we can see what happens, right? That by your fruits you shall know them, and see whether the prophecy allows itself to be enacted or subverts itself in the process of being enacted. So those are three kinds of arguments we can make, and they lead up to this idea that these orientations to existence are not just dogmas that we either accept or reject. We can argue for them, and the arguments do mean something. But the problem is the apparent disproportion between the authority of these arguments and the weight of the decision that we can make, right? The decision that we can make is about the only question that no one can escape, which is what he should do with his life, how he should live. He can avoid making explicit his answer to that question, but he will answer it nevertheless by the way in which he lives, by what he does with his life. And so there seems to be this ineradicable imbalance between the fateful character of the question and the inconclusive character of the arguments. It's not that the arguments have no substance, it's that they never seem to be enough. Now, we've tried to enhance the weight of these arguments by several strategies in the course. So one strategy has to do with the theme that's just been discussed, universalism versus provincialism. That is, to try and state each of these orientations to existence in its strongest form, and to do so in a way that arouses this worldwide discourse, which has some antidote to the influence of cultural provincialism, shaking off the dust of history, as we said. A second way in which we've tried to do it is by taking the sociology of morals to be internal to ethics. So the sociology of morals does not include in ethics, but on this version that we've been exploring in the course, ethics does include the sociology of morals. That is, that these orientations, like the two ethics that we discussed at the end, have a basis in the functional requirements of the advanced societies. They're not just abstractions, they're not just ideas. They have to do with things that are necessary to the operation of society, like the creation of the capable agent and the development of higher forms of cooperation. And a third way in which we have tried to enhance the authority of the arguments is by relating morals to politics. That's each of these moral visions has political implications, and in each case there's some complicated interplay between the political version of the ideas for the organization of society and the moral version of the ideas for the conduct of life. And one of the complications that to me seems most interesting is this relation between the two, the moral and the political, in which the moral has to make up for the failures or the omissions of the political. That's on the idea that our political projects advance or fail in historical time, whereas our moral projects have to take place in biographical time. So what we have not accomplished in politics, we must somehow achieve in morals. So there are all those ways in which we've tried to diminish the cognitive gap, the gap between the urgency of the question and the inadequacy of the arguments. But when we sum all of that up, the gap does not close, and that's the problem to which I want to draw attention. Now, in addressing that problem, it seems that there's a contrast between two ways of thinking, and it's come up in the course. So one way of thinking is we have a general view of the world, it's theological or metaphysical, and it is then the basis for our ethical orientation. And the other way of thinking is we don't have this view of a framework. All we have is ourselves. There's no one here but us, and we have to base the orientation on a view of ourselves. And it might seem that the first kind of view might hope for a greater degree of objectivity than the second kind, right? Because it's basing the orientation in a view of the framework. And that's the point that I want to address now, and I want to argue against that view. So if that view fails, then this groundlessness, this existential groundlessness, this which we could define as the tendency of any view of the world to fail to justify an orientation to existence, an orientation to the conduct of life, would remain. So take first the philosophy of the timeless one, right? There's time, phenomenal distinction is illusory. We associated this with Buddhism. Then we associated it with the philosophy of Schopenhauer. And there are, first, metaphysical problems. There are problems in accepting that view of the world. It doesn't allow us to engage with causation in the world. It presents a view of the world which is in manifest contradiction to our phenomenal experience. And it fails to explain why the world presents itself to us in a form that denies its true reality. Then there are problems that have to do with its practical implications, right? So it offers an antidote to our insatiability, to our despair, to our nihilism. But the theoretical antidote that it offers seems to be in conflict with the practical antidote that we need. So the practical antidote is to have one another's company. The practical antidote to nihilism is solidarity. But the basis of solidarity is taking the distinction of selves and the reality of time seriously. And that's what this metaphysic seems to undermine. And then finally, you could say the problem is in this metaphysic, if you take it as a basis for this orientation to existence, that it generates too many different orientations to existence. After all, in some versions, it leads to an idea of submersion in this universal being. And in other versions, it leads to a doctrine of compassionate altruism. There's the same alternation in Schopenhauer's philosophy. So which is the version that reveals the real thing, right? It's the doctrine. It seems that we would adopt the altruistic version or the oceanic version for independent reasons, and then we would pretend that it was authorized by this framework of ideas. In other words, the ethical orientation doesn't really arise from the framework of ideas. It must arise from something else. And the framework of ideas is being used, as it were, simply as the pretext or the rhetorical apparatus. So all of that results in the suspicion that if we think we're escaping this groundlessness, this cognitive gap, by appealing to a metaphysical vision like this one, we must be deluding ourselves. Now let's take another example of these visions, theological rather than metaphysical. The Semitic monotheisms, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and especially the one that we've examined most and has had greatest influence in the West, Christianity. So then we have all the problems in dealing with its idea of reality. First we have the scandals of reason, as I call them. The suspension of natural causality. Then we have the strange combination of the universal message with the historical plot. That is, the plot is all about individual agents and individual events. The message is universal. And finally, we have the incomprehensibility of the idea of God. God as person, God as being, or God as non-person and non-being. None of these three conceptions of God seems to work in the sense of allowing the idea of God to play in the religion the function that it's supposed to play. Now, there's this other problem further. Suppose we accept these beliefs altogether of the narrative of God's redemptive, creative and redemptive activity in the world. And we think God has created the world out of superabundant love, and he calls us to be with him. Then the question is, why should we? So God has done all of this. Why should we agree to play this role in the story that he wrote, right? The answer to that question is not self-evident. So if God exists, he loves us, he has this message for us, we still might want to say no. And of course, this is the theme that of the tyrannical God. So in the Hebrew Bible, in the book of Job, 38, after Job has bitterly complained about his lot, God puts him in his place, and he says, "Where were you when I laid the foundations of the earth?" Then earlier in the book of Genesis, God tyrannically demanded that Abraham bring his son Isaac to be killed at Mount Moriah. And it was only at the last moment when Abraham, obedient to the will of God, was about to kill Isaac, that the angel of God stopped him. Milton, in Paradise Lost, of course, presents the argument of Satan against God, against the tyrannical God, and the reasons why the response of the human being to God is not self-evident. And then we see now the wide variation of ways in which this doctrine of Christianity has been translated into views of the conduct of life. So the single two most influential versions are, first, the imitation of Christ. We should imitate the life of Christ. And this can't be right, because on other versions of Christian theology, the Redeemer sacrificed himself so that the burden of blood sacrifice would be lifted from humanity. So the point of the exercise was not that we would imitate Christ, it's that we would not need to imitate him. So then there's a debate about that. Or then the other view is the message of Christianity is universal altruism. But then we deny that and say the message of Christianity is love, and love is not altruism, but practical Christian ethics has not been an ethics about love. It has been an ethics about altruism. And this confusion persists. Dante Alighieri was a Christian poet, like Milton, and he engaged intensely in the world. He had an intense political life. He was defeated in most of his political objectives, but we have to judge him extraordinarily lucky. So he was lucky because he was able to live a full life in the world, but at the same time he had this idea. So he thought he was in love with Beatrice, whom actually he only saw a few times. But he married someone else, and then in the 30th canto of the Purgatorio, for the first time in the Commedia, Beatrice speaks with him, and he says, Dante. It's the only time in the Commedia that Dante's name is mentioned. And here I am, I'm Beatrice. You rejected me, you spurned me, you gave yourself to someone else. And so there's this entanglement of this worldly love, the real confusions of amorous and erotic love, which Dante, however, is able to identify with the whole nature of the universe. It's the same love which he has undergone in this conflictual form, which moves the sun and the other stars, is the basis of everything. Well, what a lucky man who is able to convince himself that these adventures of his were about the whole structure of the universe, and still to have had all of this life. Shakespeare had more doubts, right, about this, so that we can't really say that he was an Orthodox Christian. In Henry IV, Part 1, Glendower says, he boasts, I can call the spirits from the vasty deep, right? And Hotspur answer, well, of course you can call them, so can I. But when you do call them, will they come? So this is the question which is raised. So what is the point of this discourse of mine? It's to say that the appearance that there are these fixes, this metaphysical or theological fix, may be an illusion. So they have them, but not only are the metaphysical or theological visions contestable, but their practical implications are completely uncertain and are the object of conflict in history. And it's not clear what difference it makes to believe in them or not to believe in them. So we're back to the other horn of the dilemma, which is there's no one here but us, and we have only ourselves to start with, even though we may cast the spell of metaphysical or theological conviction on ourselves. So that's what I wanted to say, because I think that this conversation about colonialism and universalism is in some respects an evasion of what is the real problem. The real problem is, what is this all about? And to what extent can these alternative proposals for the orientation to existence be argued for, as opposed to just asserted or embraced or rejected? But having all of these beliefs or not having them doesn't in the end seem to put us in any different a position. So
let's throw this out again. Yes, please.
That feels like an incredibly rational argument against any hope in rationality. And I just wonder if
But of course, that's not the spirit in which I delivered it, because I do think, no, really, I'm serious. I do think that we can make these arguments for and against, the three kinds of arguments I made, the different ways of enhancing their authority. But in the end, at the end of the day, this gap remains. That's the point. And it's not that the arguments are valueless, is that they're not enough. And that then is the basis for this threat of nihilism, right? Which comes from outside the conduct of life, but then radiates inside and threatens us with this doubt about meaning, this question of meaning or meaninglessness, and our inability to avert it and to contain it through these theological or metaphysical narratives. That's the question. Now, and that's a philosophical doubt. No? Now, I think that certainly in the case of the metaphysics of the timeless one, it seems that a powerful impulse is power worship, under the disguise of pantheistic piety, theistic gratitude, or philosophical wonder. The doctrine that being, the being of the world, is the proper object of reverence. We should revere it. And the question is how we can participate in this one being. Why should we revere it? It gave us life. We have life. We won the cosmic lottery because we were born, but it will also annihilate us. And you could say, this power worship is unworthy of free men and women and dangerous to their humanity. We should have no truck with it. And the only theological and metaphysical doctrine that is acceptable is one that is untainted by the power worship.
Sir, hey, yes, please.
I'm just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the difference between the universal altruism and love, and how those two diverge as like one of the sort of variations in the doctrine of Christianity that's translated into certain like conduct of life that's not sufficient. Because I hear universal altruism, and I think of like the 1960s social gospel or something like that.
No, so let me go back to a remark made in an earlier class. So I said, the Redeemer, Christ, commanded us to love the stranger. So it seems impossible to love the stranger. This is a command that seems impossible to implement. And because it seems impossible to implement, the moral philosophers, like the ones who are revered by this, what we call the school philosophy, offer us instead the cold comfort of an impersonal and altruistic benevolence. So altruism is not love, and so altruism is given from a distance or from on high, and it involves then some sacrifice, but it has no inner jeopardy. As there was in love, Dante's love could be rebuffed. That's different from altruism. Love, unlike altruism, has a cognitive or imaginative threshold. The problem that altruism addresses is the problem of selfishness, of the preference that the ego gives to itself. And it then invites us to overcome that. In love, the problem is the imagination of the other, the imagination of the otherness of the other. It's a different problem. And the objective is not the restriction of selfishness, The objective is the reconciliation between these two godlike human beings. It's a completely different idea, and with different consequences. Altruism could require great sacrifice, even the sacrifice of one's own life, but there's no heightening of inner vulnerability. So they're two fundamentally different directions. And it's very strange that in the moral interpretation of Christianity, the idea of altruism should have prevailed, as in the common conventional notion of Christian charity. It's the negation of love. It's not love, although it can have a connection to love. Yes?
Maybe following up that, it seems like these moral philosophers who said, like, loving the stranger is too hard, so we're going to go something else. Implicit in there is this idea that these things should be potentially achievable, and so I'm wondering if that's like a psychological bias that we have. Like, is there a requirement that a proper ethics or conduct of life is like theoretically achievable by people? Because it seems like we've sort of implicitly said.
But it's for us, right? It's not for some other kind of being. So,
Sure, yeah.
so we must be able to enact it.
Well, like, to what extent is it like we should be like physically able to try to do this, but potentially know that we'll never succeed versus, have an illusion of success as a potential outcome?
This kind of splitting of hairs, right? So this seems like somewhat scholastic, but I think so. So if it's a self-fulfilling prophecy on which we can act, we should be able to try, at least to try to act it out. And when we try, we can then see what happens. And that will give us vital information about this ethic and its authority. So I think the hope in the ethic of love is that the attempt to expand the circle of love can succeed, but the emotion of affection requires as an ally the imagination. So it requires the imagination of the subjectivity of another human being, right? And this is very difficult. Heraclitus said, the soul of another person is a dark continent that can never be visited. So the ethic of love, if it's to be put in this position, requires us to defy this belief of Heraclitus. We will try to visit the other continent. But it's a different thing. So the history of Christianity then is in large part a history of these heresies. It's not a view of on its face. It's not about love. It's about altruism, practical Christian ethics. It enters into a series of compromises with established regimes of social life, like feudalism in Europe, or the Victorian ethic of familial respectability. These are contingent and even perverse compromises of the Christian vision with worldly structures. So that's the history. So the true form of the religion is then something that is in tension with what the religion has mainly been. So I understand that this is an argument with many sides, but the doubt that I was trying to raise by my intervention is to what extent these theological or metaphysical fixes to which we appeal as the basis change anything in our basic situation. Because it seems when you've gone through all of these points that I've made, that they leave us more or less in the same situation that we were in before. They introduce different ideals, but they haven't altered the fundamental fact of our groundlessness. Now, our groundlessness might not matter so much if it weren't for another incurable flaw in the human condition, which is our mortality. If we were immortal, maybe this groundlessness would have a completely different significance. We could say, well, we'll always have time to think about that later on, right? We would be grazing like the animals, right? Like Nietzsche's conception of the animals. So they don't know what's coming, and they have no conception of time, supposedly. And so it's the combination of the groundlessness with the mortality, which is then decisive. And then there's this other incurable flaw in the human condition, which is our insatiability. We want everything. We want the unlimited. The world is not enough, right? And we're surrounded only by these finite things, and the finite things then are proxies for something else that we want. What do we want? We want the absolute. We want the unconditional. We want, among other things, an assurance, an unconditional assurance that there's a place for each of us in the world. And so we risk having our lives consumed in this chase after these false proxies, one form of false transcendence after another. So it seems to me that the study of these traditions, of these theological and metaphysical traditions, is certainly a warning about these spiritual dangers that we encounter on the way. What I don't think it can be is a solution to the problem of groundlessness. Yes?
What if we don't treat groundlessness as a defect or an incurable flaw in our human condition? What if we reframe it as a source of fertility, of imagination, of power? Is that a possibility? Would you be open to that? Or is
Well,
that probably
one way to respond to it is through empowerment, right? But then we spoke about this in relation to Nietzsche, right? So this is what we called early in the course Prometheanism, right? So you could say an idea, a certain idea of empowerment or the enhancement of agency is like beating the drums in the presence of death. So you're going to die. You're told that you're going to die. You're on the chariot in the triumphal procession. The slave is in the chariot whispering into your ear, memento mori, remember that you will die. And so what's your reaction? You increase the noise of the acclamation of the crowd, of the triumphal festivities, as if one could compensate for the other. All too human, Nietzsche would say, but not a solution to the problem.
But again, the moment we call it a problem, it sets us up. It establishes a particular orientation. For example, this class, we're 12 weeks in or so, queasy, the groundlessness of our existence. I don't know about the rest of you, but I'm struggling here. And yet, look at the generativity of the groundlessness. If there were no groundlessness,
Of course,
we wouldn't
of
show up
course.
to the class because we are.
That's why someone said early on is these flaws, as I'm calling them, are constitutive. They're not just contingent defects in our situation. They're decisive for who we are, for our capabilities. Yes, that's all true. If we weren't mortal, it would be completely different, right? So it's this combination of mortality and groundlessness. But I'm trying to evoke here a puzzle which is difficult to state conceptually. So we have these orientations to existence, and we have arguments for them and against them, and we're able to understand them. So it's not just that it's a completely blind comparison. But this is all occurring in a situation in which we really don't have the faintest idea why we're here. And there's a complete surrounding darkness, and we're on the way to death. And then we have these orientations to existence. So this is all. So a problem arises when when part of the function of the orientation to existence becomes to serve as a lullaby, as a form of consolation or self-deception, that prevents us then from using this basic circumstance of our mortality and groundlessness to wake us up, because while we're alive, we should be fully alive, and the awakening is served by the confrontation with its reality. So that's part of this picture. And one of the great harms that the school philosophy has done is to take all of that away and replace it with this stupid Pharisaical exercise of reading from the rule book for us, So this is our situation, but so long as we can say we have clean hands, don't pin anything on me, I didn't do anything, and I can come to the end of my life showing that I have clean hands, then I'm good. It's stupid. It's not a serious way for a human being to think of himself.
I think you've adequately evoked the puzzle. I feel very uncomfortable right now.
Well, and at the risk of adding to your uncomfort, so
I'm here by consent.
exactly. We've locked the doors, so
Well,
yep.
Go ahead.
But building on this question and the previous question, part of what's so powerful about all three of these traditions we've been looking at least as we've argued, the most powerful reading, they actually underline these facts that ultimately they'll describe groundlessness differently, and they will describe, going back to the earlier question too, the impossibility of our work differently in very telling and powerful ways. However, they are both absolutely committed to it. So from the self-fashioning model, absolutely. Just let me throw into the example too. In Buddhism, note the move here. So as Roberto has argued, in its strongest form, the self-fashioning mode is to say the world is what it is and is not something else. Of course, in Buddhism, the opening move is the world is not what it is, and everything in your experience
It's completely
is
different
wrong.
from what it seems
Absolutely.
to be. Yeah.
Everything you're experiencing is wrong. That is not the world. That is a construct. Your goal is to break through it. And going back to the earlier question about the impossibility, in Buddhism, you can spend your life trying to break out of this illusory self and illusory world that you've constructed, causing so much suffering. And the explicit argument is you can do so for the next endless eons of multiple rebirths, in which at best you'll get slightly better at each time. At the moment when you think you've got it and are about to finally achieve nirvana, if you then try to achieve nirvana, that's selfish because it means you're not trying to help end all the suffering in the world. So you lose it because you have become selfish, and then the whole process starts again. So the whole push is this radical, almost as much as you could imagine, claim that the world is not what you perceive it to be, and the absolute impossibility of fully breaking out of it. But then that cuts to the heart of the question, why? And it builds in this incredible anxiety about the suffering we're creating, and when it works, this incredible push toward universal compassion, which it builds in the impossibility of ever resolving. Confucianism is less extreme because it doesn't have the reincarnation, but similarly, like one of the absolute untouchables, and therefore the strongest criticism you can make of even those who are trying to cultivate themselves in the modes we've been talking about and working toward the word there is a sage, someone who would just so flawlessly be able to work with the world, to shift trajectories, etc. The strongest criticism you can give is someone thinking they've achieved sagehood, because by definition that means they stop working, and that's the strongest criticism you can give. This is the moment when that person failed because they think they became a sage. Or, going back to the earlier question, you build in the impossibility of it. You cannot achieve it. And the flip side of that is, as we've seen repeatedly, the dangers of these traditions are when people try to end that groundlessness and that impossibility. So when Hegel says the Prussian state has accomplished the end of history, or even more laughably Fukuyama with 1990s America, but the claim that we can actually finally achieve a moment when we are happy in the world and everything will work out and we know what to do, there are few things more dangerous. And these traditions, they're most powerful, build in, if you take them seriously, the absolute impossibility of the work and the total groundlessness in the sense that there's never any possible metaphysical explanation of ultimately how the world operates. Sorry. We'll unlock the door, we promised, at some point. Yes, please.
Is it possible that the way that we're talking about the metaphysical orientations as sort of a rational explanation or justification for how we ought to behave in the world is itself still trapped within sort of a modernist way of thinking, instrumentalizing these as opposed to taking either an a-modern, or I don't want to use pre-modern, but let's go a-modern, trying to act outside of it, sort of in the sense of Bruno Latour, right? If we, I don't know how this would happen, but it feels like we're instrumentalizing them in a way that is deeply modern.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure I understand what you mean exactly.
That too subjective.
Because these ideas, the philosophy of the timeless one, and the Semitic monotheisms have been around for 2,500 years, right?
But the way that we are engaging with them feels very modern to say, we need to solve for X, how ought we live? We're faced with all this evidence and there's one variable. And if we can figure that out, we can determine which of these things or put them in tension with each other and sort of let that marinate for a while, we will have better control over our circumstances in a way that reasserts modernity's claim to dominance.
I don't think this is about control, right? This is about what the truth is and how we can make sense of the world and the limits to our ability to make sense of it. Right?
That's a modernist project.
No, why is that a modernist project? That's the project of the philosophers. It has in the West. That's been the project for over 2,000 years. That was the project of Plato and Aristotle. Why is that a modernist project? I don't understand that.
Something to me feels that there is a rationalism or a separation of ourselves from it. I don't know. I can't express it right now.
No. So I think I'm very sympathetic to the impulse underlying that remark, because I think these intellectual options should not be approached as if it were a kind of shell game, right? This is about things that have the most decisive consequence, and we have to approach them seriously. And this is exactly the complaint against the school philosophy. That's a trivialization of ethics. And ethics has to be associated with our fundamental existential longings, hopes, fears. And so the question is how we can form a way of thinking out of that. And it's certain that this conversation that Michael and all of you are pointing to, this universal conversation free from provincialism, in which we take views from around the world, can strengthen our ability, but it doesn't seem to me to reach the ultimate point of dealing with these issues of groundlessness and mortality and their consequences for the authority of our moral visions.
And let me give a concrete example, both agreeing with that and very much agreeing with the question. So let's put on the table, metaphorically speaking, one assumption that both Roberto and I have been making, which is a pretty significant assumption, and I agree, is part of a modernist project. And as you know, I'm always very scared of modernist projects, but bam, here's one we're doing, and therefore we should all be questioning it. We have repeatedly been saying, What would it mean when we're wrestling with these ideas to give a secular naturalized version? Now, we keep saying in their most powerful form, we keep noting the dangerous ways these ideas have been secularized and naturalized, but let's get back to secularized and naturalized. That's a pretty big move. Now, we've been arguing for it, but that's to say that that is a huge push against most of the dominant traditions we've been arguing against is to make a huge understatement. It is certainly a modernist project, which, by definition, I think we should always be suspicious about. Are we doing the right thing? Is that a move that's so dangerous we lose, even if we try to do it in the strongest form that we can imagine, is that still incredibly delimiting at some level? Because isn't that at some levels taking an anthropocentric perspective, assuming a human perspective where we are philosophically wrestling with how we should live in the world? That is one hell of a set of assumptions that all three of the traditions, albeit less actually the Confucianism, but certainly the Christian and Buddhist traditions would say that is a really dangerous move to make. So we should throw that on the table. Yes. Yes, please.
I mean, it seems like that, I guess the reason why these maybe that's the wrong way to phrase this, originally religions was this cognitive gap of that the religious part of these philosophies was sort of filling in that cognitive gap in ways that were, potentially harmful and blinding to some reality, but was psychologically fulfilling that role. And I guess maybe I was trying to take a step back from that, and I guess we're all here because we think wrestling with these questions is important, and that's another assumption where it seems like there's this cognitive gap of why is it necessary to grapple with these three flaws of the human existence in order to live a good life. And I guess I buy into the idea that if you have some idea that is sort of erasing those, or sort of the lullaby of religion to get around them, that's harmful and that's not good. But if you're someone who's just maybe not predisposed to worry about these things, does that imply that that person is not fully alive in some sense, or is not capable of living a good life? If I, a couple of years ago, if I just wasn't worried about this and never took the class, am I never gonna live a full life? And I mean, that's not too much of a joke question.
Yeah, yes.
So, and what's the practical implication?
Well, I mean, maybe that gets to, I guess it seems like we have presupposed that it's important to wrestle with these questions in the same way that we've, and I guess I'm wondering if either of you have an opinion on that.
So yes, I think you're right to put this on the table too. And the answer is yes, we are indeed arguing that. And as with everything, feel free to question it. So we are arguing, and here, at least this one I'm happy to say is not a modernist project, because this certainly is embedded in all three of the traditions from the beginning, but all three of those traditions, and we agree with them in this sense, that they are saying an opening move should be to break us from the, I'll already use a strong word that presupposes the answer to the question, that a complacent acceptance of the world as it currently is, and our lives as we currently experience it, as being perfectly fine, and all three of these are committed to breaking us out of the complacency of that view. Now, I freely admit, and I suspect all three of these traditions, albeit in different ways, would say, in answer to your question, you probably will lead a happier life if you don't pose these questions. But happy is a limited concept, or it's a perfectly fine concept. It's a very limited experience of the world, because the danger is that it can lead to a complacent existence where you will simply live out your role, or as they would put in Confucianism, live out the patterns of your life, never think about them, and things will be fine. And all three traditions are going to, in radically different ways, try to break us out of that and try to force us to rethink our lives and rethink the world. And we obviously are committed to that. going back to the terminology that we use in the Confucian tradition, they'll say the goal isn't happiness, it's joy. And what they mean is the difference is joy is the sensibility of difficult to achieve, but of resonance and connection with everything. As I mentioned before, joy and music. It's the same character in Chinese. It's this flawless resonance with everything, which is different from happiness, in which I can be happy for a limited amount of time playing out patterns, but it's incredibly limited. Now, we are agreeing with that, I mean, not just that position, but I mean the position of all three of these in different ways, saying we should break out of the complacency of our accepted lives. But even though be happier if you don't do this, I would even agree. I think we'd be happier if you had never taken this course. But yeah, the goal is we should seek for something beyond our immediate happiness.
So in the tradition of Western philosophy, there are two ideas of happiness, right? There's happiness as privation of pain and suffering. That's the negative idea. We still find it in Schopenhauer, for example.
Yeah.
And then there's the other idea of happiness, which is present in Aristotle already, which is happiness is fullness of activity, and therefore has a contradictory character, because we develop ourselves in many different dimensions, and these contradictions conflict and they impose pain. So it's incompatible with the first idea of happiness.
Yes,
now, this second idea then is connected to a conception of who we are. We are unaccommodated. We don't fit in structures. And that's related to an idea of vitality. So before goodness and badness, before right and wrong, comes life. Hölderlin said, "He who thinks most deeply loves what is most alive." Life comes first, vitality. And vitality then has among its attributes this surfeit over structure. So the association with the confrontation with groundlessness and mortality is that we think that we arouse in ourselves this sentiment, this emotion of unaccommodation, of being unaccommodated, by facing the reality of our situation. And the reward for that is to possess more life. So it's not that we're just trying to impose more pain on ourselves. And these two secular ethics that we discussed at the end of the course could be seen, among other things, as two interpretations of that idea, two ways to go, once you accept that. But they both, the maximalist form of the ethic of connection and the corrected form of the ethic of self-fashioning, both presuppose this idea of the tension between vitality and structure. And therefore they both require this confrontation with the reality of our existence.
Did you want to follow up? Yes, please, of course, of course.
I mean, it seems like, I guess, my take on that, and I could be wrong, is that it's not necessarily that both of these ethics require, the ethic does not come first and then require a confrontation with our existence. There has to be an inkling of that confrontation to start, and then.
But the question is who we are, who these ethics are for, right? So the entomologist E.A. Wilson, speaking about Marxism, about Marxist social theory, he said, right theory, wrong species, because it wasn't for the ants, it's for us. No? For the ants are very solidaristic, and for the ants, a confrontation with these things is only a perturbation, it's a disturbance of the normal operation of their colonies, right? But for us, it has a different character. That's the point. So it relates to a conception of who we are, and therefore also our hopes, because this isn't just a debate. And this raises another point in the course that we really discuss next week, which is the placement of this in the development of humanity and its political development. And I mentioned this earlier on before. So in the last 300 years, there's this revolutionary program in the world. And I've said it has two sides. It has the political side of democracy, liberalism, socialism. And what it promises to humanity is to lift the grid of entrenched social division and hierarchy weighing on our relations to one another. And the second side is the personalist side rather than the political. And its main carrier in the world has been Romanticism, especially the worldwide popular romantic culture. Popular music, the film, the soap opera, etc. They carry in a simplified sentimental form, they carry the message that the ordinary man and woman is not so ordinary after all. It has this godlike character and can rise to a higher form of life. That's the message. Now, this is an incendiary project, right? So the world has been literally put on fire by this message over the last 300 years. We are living in a counter-revolutionary interlude in this long revolutionary period in the history of humanity. So this project remains the strongest project in the world in the sense that it continues to command the agenda, because it has many enemies in the world, but all of its enemies respond to it. But it's at the same time now weak because its adepts no longer know what its next steps should be on either the political side or the moral side. So from my standpoint, the significance of this course is to be an exploration of what the next steps on the moral side should be. Because I want the revolution to continue. I don't want my ideas and actions to be shaped by the biases of the counter-revolutionary interlude. So that's my take on our project. And that's the context, the political, ideological context in which it arises. Yes?
So what's the counter-revolutionary interlude that we're in?
An interlude, so it's an interlude, first of all, of stagnation, in institutional change, and in moral revolution. But second, it's an interlude of confusion, because people don't know what the next is. The only way in which a project like this one can live is if it's perpetually reinvented, right? The law of the spirit is that you can preserve, you can keep alive only what you renounce and reinvent. You can't keep it alive like a fossil in a museum, right? And so if you don't know what its next steps should be, you can't keep it, because then it begins to wither. So that's how I think of it, and it's related to an idea of life. And so what are its next steps? So the form that it has in the world is this romantic form, popular romantic form. The characteristic of popular romanticism is sentimental, and sentimental means formulaic. So that's an inferior form. So it needs a higher form, and to be kept alive, to inspire. And that stands in stark opposition to the Pharisaical teaching of the school philosophy, which is about rules and obligations and so forth. As Milton said, so many laws argue so many sins.
And that is a perfect note to wrap up our discussion today. So, as we mentioned, next week we will not be giving opening statements, or if we do, it will be very, very brief. What we really want to do next week is open this up for you all. mentioned, you're of course welcome to ask questions. Those are always welcome. But also feel free, if you would like to make arguments. All of you are working on your final projects. If you would like to take the opportunity next week to discuss your final projects with us, with the full group, you are absolutely welcome to. And our goal, as you can see by our way of putting that, is not to summarize and bring to a conclusion our discussions of the semester. It is rather to hopefully open up and inspire all of us to continue on this journey that we are very grateful you have joined us with for 13 weeks, and we very much look forward to a lifetime of wrestling with these issues in whatever form we can, as we are, and we are convinced, mortal, and for that brief period of time when we are still on this planet. Thank you so much, and see you next week.